The small town of San Miguel sat like a forgotten coin on the dusty border between Mexico and America. It was 1952, and life moved slowly here, marked by the rhythm of morning roosters and evening church bells. In a tiny adobe house at the end of a dirt road, a baby girl came into the world on a cold December night. But something was different about little Rosa. Her eyes, though perfectly formed, could not see the candle flames that danced in her mother's hands. She could not see her father's weathered face or the faded photographs of saints that hung on their cracked walls. Rosa had been born blind, and in a place where survival depended on hard work in the fields. This seemed like a curse that the family could not bear. Her mother, Carmen, was only 19 when Rosa was born. She had already buried 2 babies before Rosa came along, and the weight of loss had made her heart feel like stone. When the local doctor confirmed that Rosa would never see, Carmen wept for 3 days straight. Her husband, Diego, worked from sunrise to sunset in the bean fields, earning barely enough pesos to buy corn and beans for their table. "How can we care for a child who cannot work?" Diego whispered to his wife late one night, thinking Rosa was asleep. But the little girl heard everything. Even as a baby, her hearing was sharp as a hawk's vision. As Rosa grew from a baby into a toddler, she developed abilities that amazed and sometimes frightened her parents. She could tell when someone was approaching their house long before they knocked. She knew which pot was boiling on the stove just by the sound. She could find her way around their small home without bumping into anything, her tiny hands feeling along the walls like she was reading a book written in touch. But instead of seeing these as gifts, her parents saw them as reminders of what she lacked. Other children her age were already helping in the fields carrying water or watching over chickens. Rosa sat in the corner of their one-room house, listening to the world go by outside their door. The neighbors whispered about the blind girl. Some said she was blessed, others said she was cursed. Old women crossed themselves when they saw her, and children stared until their mothers pulled them away. Rosa felt all of this, even without seeing the looks or hearing all the words. The feeling of being different, of being unwanted, settled into her bones like winter cold. When Rosa turned 5, times became even harder for the family. A drought killed most of the crops, and Diego lost his job in the fields. Carmen tried selling tortillas at the market, but there were too many other women doing the same thing. Food became scarce, and some nights Rosa went to bed with only water in her stomach. It was during this difficult time that strangers began visiting their house. They came at night, speaking in low voices with her parents in the next room. Rosa would press her ear to the thin wall and listen, but they spoke in words she didn't understand. All she knew was that after these visits her mother would cry, and her father would drink more than usual. One evening, when Rosa was 7 years old, a well-dressed woman came to their house. She had a soft voice and spoke Spanish with an accent Rosa had never heard before. The woman told Carmen and Diego that she knew families in America who would take care of Rosa, give her a good home where her blindness wouldn't be a burden. "She will have food every day," the woman said. "Clean clothes, a warm bed. She will be safe and you will be free to take care of yourselves." Rosa listened from her corner, her heart beating fast. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt danger in the air like the smell of smoke before a fire. That night her mother came and sat beside her on the thin mattress they shared. Carmen's hands were shaking as she stroked Rosa's long black hair. "Mija," she whispered, "tomorrow, you are going on a journey. You are going to live with a new family, people who can take better care of you than we can." Rosa's world turned upside down. "But I don't want a new family," she said, grabbing her mother's dress. "I want to stay with you and Papa." Carmen was crying now, her tears falling onto Rosa's face. "You don't understand, little one. We have no choice. We cannot feed you. We cannot give you what you need. These people, they have money. They have resources. You will be better off." But Rosa understood more than her mother realized. She had heard the conversations, felt the tension in the house, sensed the finality in her mother's voice. This wasn't about finding her a better home. This was about getting rid of a burden they could no longer carry. The next morning came too soon. Rosa woke to the sound of unfamiliar footsteps in their house. The well-dressed woman had returned, and she had brought a man with her. He had a rough voice and smelled like cigarettes and something else Rosa couldn't identify but instinctively feared. "Is she ready?" the man asked. Rosa felt her mother's hands putting clean clothes on her, the nicest dress she owned, which was still patched and faded. Carmen packed Rosa's few belongings into a small cloth bag, another dress, a wooden doll her father had carved for her 3rd birthday, and a rosary that had belonged to her grandmother. "Remember to pray every night," Carmen whispered, pressing the rosary into Rosa's small hands. "And remember that we love you." But Rosa could feel the lie in those words. If they loved her, why were they sending her away? Why were these strangers taking her from the only home she had ever known? The man lifted Rosa up without gentleness, carrying her outside to a truck that rumbled like an angry beast. She heard her parents following, their footsteps slow and heavy. At the truck, her mother kissed her forehead one last time. "Be good, mija," Carmen said, her voice breaking. "Be very good." Rosa reached out for her mother, but her hands found only air. She was already being placed in the back of the truck on a wooden bench next to other people she couldn't see but could sense. The truck started moving, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. As the miles passed, Rosa understood that she would probably never see her parents again. She was 8 years old, blind, and completely alone in a world that had already decided she didn't belong anywhere. The other passengers in the truck were quiet, lost in their own fears and uncertainties. Rosa clutched her grandmother's rosary and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she listened to the sounds around her, the truck's engine, the wind through the canvas cover, the nervous breathing of the people beside her. She was learning to survive by listening, by feeling, by understanding the world through senses her parents had never bothered to notice she possessed. The truck stopped many times during the long journey. Sometimes people got out, and new people got in. Rosa stayed, too afraid to move, too young to run, too blind to know where she would go if she tried. Food was scarce, water was precious, and nobody spoke to her except to tell her to stay quiet. On the 3rd day, the truck finally stopped for the last time. Rosa was pulled out and handed over to another family, Americans who spoke English and lived in a house bigger than anything she had ever imagined. But this house, for all its size, felt colder than her tiny adobe home had ever been. The new family made it clear from the beginning that Rosa was there to work, not to be loved. They gave her a small room in the basement and a list of chores that seemed impossible for a blind child to complete. But Rosa was determined to survive, to prove that her parents had been wrong about her being useless. Every day she learned something new about navigating this strange new world. She memorized the layout of the house by counting steps and feeling walls. She learned to recognize people by their footsteps, their breathing, their scent. She discovered she could tell time by the way the house sounded, quiet in the early morning, busy during the day, settling into creaks and sighs at night. The work was hard, and the people were unkind, but Rosa endured. She washed dishes by touch, swept floors she couldn't see, and folded laundry with fingers that learned to detect the smallest wrinkle. When she made mistakes, she was punished with harsh words and sometimes worse. But she never complained, never cried where anyone could hear. Late at night, alone in her basement room, Rosa would hold her grandmother's rosary and think about the parents who had sold her because she was blind. The hurt went so deep that sometimes she felt like it might break her in half. But instead of breaking, she grew stronger. Each day of survival was proof that she was more than her blindness, more than the burden her family thought she was. 3 years passed this way. Rosa learned English by listening carefully to conversations around her. She grew taller and stronger, her other senses becoming so sharp that she could navigate the world better than many people who could see. She was no longer the frightened little girl who had been handed over to strangers. She was becoming someone new, someone who refused to accept that being blind made her worthless. And deep in her heart, a plan was beginning to form. A plan that would take her far away from the people who saw her as nothing more than free labor. far away from the memory of parents who had chosen to let her go. Rosa was learning that sometimes the only person who could save you was yourself, and she was getting ready to do exactly that. The basement room where Rosa slept was directly under the kitchen, and sound traveled through the old floorboards like water through a sieve. This turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. She could hear everything the family said above her head, which meant she knew things they never intended for her to know. It was a Tuesday night in March when Rosa overheard the conversation that changed everything. She had been living with the Johnson family for 3 years now, and at 11 years old she had grown too familiar with their routines, too comfortable with their cruelty. Maybe that was why they were planning to get rid of her. "She's getting too big," Mrs. Johnson was saying to her husband. "People are starting to ask questions about the Mexican girl in our basement, and she eats more now." "The Hendersons said they'd take her," Mr. Johnson replied. "They live way out in the desert. Nobody asks questions out there, and they'll pay us twice what we paid for her." Rosa's blood went cold. She pressed her ear harder against the ceiling, hardly daring to breathe. "When?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "This weekend, Saturday morning. We'll tell her we're taking her to town for new clothes, then drop her off. Simple as that." Rosa lay on her thin mattress, staring into the darkness that was her constant companion, and felt something break inside her chest. Not break with sadness this time, but break open with a fierce kind of determination she had never felt before. She would not let them sell her again. She would not spend the rest of her life being passed from one cruel family to another like a piece of unwanted furniture. For the next 3 days, Rosa planned. She had learned the layout of not just the house, but the entire neighborhood during her rare trips outside. She knew that Highway 60 ran east and west, about 2 miles north of the Johnson house. She had heard trucks rumbling along that road at all hours, and she knew that if she could reach it, she might find help. The problem was getting there. 2 miles didn't sound like much, but for a blind girl who had never traveled alone beyond the Johnson property, it might as well have been 200 miles. The desert stretched between the house and the highway, full of dangers she could only imagine. But Rosa had advantages that most people didn't realize. Her hearing was so sharp that she could tell which direction sounds came from with pinpoint accuracy. Her sense of touch had developed to the point where she could feel changes in the ground beneath her feet, sense obstacles before she ran into them. Most importantly, 3 years of surviving in a hostile environment had taught her that she was much stronger than anyone gave her credit for. On Friday night, Rosa barely slept. She lay listening to the house settle around her, memorizing every sound. At around 2 in the morning, she heard Mr. Johnson get up to use the bathroom as he did every night. Mrs. Johnson snored lightly, a sound Rosa had grown to hate. The teenage Johnson son played music too loud in his room until nearly midnight, then fell asleep so deeply that a train could have run through his room without waking him. Rosa had decided to leave at dawn. Early enough that the family would still be sleeping, but late enough that she could use the morning sounds of the desert to navigate. She had heard coyotes at night and knew they were most active in the darkness. Better to travel when they were returning to their dens. She had packed everything she owned into her grandmother's old pillowcase. It wasn't much. 1 extra dress, the wooden doll her father had carved, the rosary, and a piece of bread she had saved from dinner. She had also taken one of Mrs. Johnson's old water bottles, filling it quietly from the bathroom tap. As the first hint of dawn began to warm the air outside her basement window, Rosa made her move. The basement had a door that led directly outside, but it squeaked terribly. Rosa had been testing it for days, opening it just a crack at different times to learn exactly how to move it without making noise. She eased the door open inch by inch, pausing between each movement to listen for any sounds from upstairs. The house remained quiet. Finally, the door was open wide enough for her to slip through. The morning air hit her face like freedom. Rosa had spent so much time trapped inside the Johnson house that she had almost forgotten how good it felt to breathe fresh air, to feel space around her instead of walls pressing close. She oriented herself by sound and feeling. The house was behind her. The north-facing kitchen window was to her right, which meant the highway was straight ahead and slightly left. She began walking, her feet finding the worn path that led from the back door to the chicken coop. Past the, chicken coop, the ground changed. The packed dirt of the yard gave way to looser soil with scattered rocks and desert plants. Rosa's bare feet found each obstacle, learning to read the landscape through touch. She walked slowly but steadily, pausing every few minutes to listen for any sounds that might indicate danger or help. The sun climbed higher, and the desert began to wake up around her. She heard the chittering of small animals in the brush, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The air smelled different out here, cleaner with hints of sage and something else she couldn't identify, but found comforting. After what felt like hours but was probably only one, Rosa's feet found something new, a dirt road. It was barely more than 2 tire tracks worn into the desert floor, but it was definitely a road. Roads led somewhere, and somewhere was better than the nowhere she was leaving behind. She followed the road, staying in the center where the walking was easier. The sun was getting hot now, and she was grateful for the water bottle, taking small sips to make it last. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the bread in her pillowcase, but she decided to save it for later. The road curved and climbed, and Rosa could sense that she was walking up a hill. Her legs burned with the effort, but she pushed forward. At the top of the hill, she stopped to rest and listen. And that's when she heard it, the distant rumble of traffic on a major highway. Highway 60. It had to be. Rosa's heart leapt with hope, but she forced herself to be careful. The sound was still far away, and she had learned not to trust distances in the desert. Sounds could carry for miles in the dry air, making things seem closer than they actually were. She continued walking, and the road began to slope downward. The highway sounds grew gradually louder, confirming that she was heading in the right direction. But the sun was getting brutal now, beating down on her head and shoulders with an intensity she had never experienced. By midday, Rosa was in serious trouble. The water bottle was nearly empty. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her feet were cut and swollen from walking on rough ground. The bread was long gone, eaten when hunger became too much to ignore. Worst of all, the highway sound seemed to be getting fainter instead of louder. Had she taken a wrong turn? Was she walking in circles? Without sight to guide her, Rosa had to trust her other senses completely. But the heat was making it hard to think clearly. She stumbled and fell, scraping her hands on sharp rocks. For a moment, lying there in the dirt with the sun burning her back, Rosa almost gave up. It would be easier to just stay here, to let the desert take her rather than face whatever the Henderson family had planned for her. At least out here she would die free. But then she heard something that made her lift her head and listen carefully. Water. The sound of water moving over rocks. Rosa struggled to her feet and followed the sound. Her nose confirmed what her ears had detected. There was definitely water nearby, carrying the green smell of plants and moisture. After another 100 yards of careful walking, she found it. A small creek, probably runoff from the recent spring rains. She fell to her knees at the water's edge and drank deeply, not caring that it might not be clean. The water was cool and sweet, and it brought her back to life like nothing else could have. She refilled her water bottle and splashed water on her face and arms, cooling her sunburned skin. As she sat by the creek, Rosa realized that she could hear voices in the distance, human voices, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Her first instinct was to hide, but then she realized that anyone out here in the desert was probably not looking for a runaway blind girl. They might even help her. She followed the creek, downstream toward the voices, moving as quietly as she could. As she got closer, she began to make out individual words, though she still couldn't understand the language. It sounded like Native American speech, similar to what she had sometimes heard on the radio. The voices were coming from a clearing ahead, where the creek widened into a small pool. Rosa crept closer, her heart pounding. She could hear at least 3 different people, all men, talking in calm, measured tones. They didn't sound angry or threatening, but Rosa had learned not to trust first impressions. She was trying to decide whether to reveal herself or sneak away when her foot caught on a fallen branch. She tumbled forward with a crash that seemed to echo across the entire desert. The voices stopped immediately. Rosa lay still, hardly daring to breathe, but she knew it was too late. Footsteps were approaching her hiding spot, careful but determined. A shadow fell across her face and she heard a gentle voice speaking in English with an accent she had never heard before. "It's okay, little sister," the voice said. "We're not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" Rosa looked up toward the voice, knowing her blind eyes probably looked strange and frightening to whoever was standing there. But instead of the first thing Rosa noticed about the Apache reservation was the silence. Not the empty, frightening silence of the desert, but a peaceful quiet filled with the sounds of life lived at a gentler pace. Children playing in the distance, dogs barking. Lazily in the afternoon heat, the soft murmur of conversation from people who had time to actually talk to each other. Joe Crow Dog and his brothers had carried her the last few miles when her battered feet could no longer support her weight. They had wrapped her cuts in clean cloth, shared their water and food with her, and never once asked her why a blind Mexican girl was wandering alone through the Arizona desert. That question would come later, they seemed to understand. For now, it was enough that she needed help. The reservation stretched out like a small town built of hope and determination. Rosa could sense the layout through her feet and ears. Dirt roads connecting clusters of houses, the sound of a school bell in the distance, the comforting noise of daily life happening all around her. After years of hiding in basements and walking on tiptoe around angry people, this felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Joe Crow Dog brought her to a small house where an elderly woman sat on the front porch shelling beans. Rosa heard the rhythmic sound of the work stopping as they approached, felt the weight of curious but not unkind eyes studying her. "Grandmother," Joe said in English, though Rosa suspected he could have spoken Apache. "This is the girl we found by Devil's Creek. She needs help." The old woman stood up, and Rosa heard the creak of wooden porch steps as she came down to meet them. Gentle hands touched Rosa's face, examining the sunburned skin and cracked lips with the practiced touch of someone who knew how to heal. "Child," the woman said in a voice like honey poured over gravel, "you look like you've been walking through hell itself. Come inside. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." This was Grandmother Willow, though Rosa wouldn't learn her name until later. What she learned immediately was that this woman's touch held no judgment, no disgust at Rosa's appearance or condition. There was only care. The kind of care Rosa had dreamed about but never really believed existed. Inside the small house, Grandmother Willow prepared a bath in a large metal tub, testing the water temperature with her elbow just like Rosa's own mother had done when Rosa was very small. But unlike her mother, Grandmother Willow helped Rosa into the tub without any impatience or complaints about wasted time and effort. "That water's been sitting in the sun all day," the old woman explained as Rosa sank gratefully into the warm bath. "Good for washing away more than just dirt, if you know what I mean." While Rosa soaked, Grandmother Willow tended to her feet, cleaning the cuts and applying what smelled like herbal medicine. The old woman hummed while she worked, an unfamiliar melody that somehow made Rosa feel safer than she had in years. "These feet have walked a long way," Grandmother Willow observed. "But they brought you where you needed to be, didn't they?" Rosa didn't know how to answer that. She had run away from the Johnson family in desperation, with no real plan beyond reaching the highway. She certainly hadn't been looking for an Apache reservation or this kind stranger who treated her injuries like they mattered. After the bath, Grandmother Willow dressed Rosa in clean clothes that smelled like sunshine and desert sage. The clothes were too big, but they were soft and comfortable in a way Rosa had almost forgotten was possible. Then came food. Real food, prepared with care and served on clean dishes. There was fry bread, still warm from the pan, and a stew thick with vegetables and meat. Rosa ate slowly, trying not to seem desperate even though she was hungrier than she had ever been in her life. Grandmother Willow sat across from her, eating her own meal, and occasionally making gentle conversation. "My grandson Joe says you speak good English," the old woman said. "Where did you learn?" "From the family I lived with," Rosa replied carefully. She wasn't ready to tell the whole story yet. Wasn't sure these kind people would believe her or know what to do with the truth of what had happened to her. And where are they now, this family? Rosa's hands tightened on her spoon. I don't live with them anymore. Grandmother Willow nodded as if this explained everything. Sometimes families aren't the people who share your blood, she said quietly. Sometimes real family is the people who choose to love you, even when they don't have to. After dinner, Grandmother Willow showed Rosa to a small room at the back of the house. It had a real bed with clean sheets and a pillow that smelled like lavender. There was a window that let in the evening breeze, and Rosa could hear nightbirds settling into their roosts outside. You rest now, Grandmother Willow said, tucking the blankets around Rosa like she was a beloved granddaughter instead of a strange runaway girl. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. That night, Rosa slept deeply for the first time in years. No one yelled at her. No one demanded that she get up and work before dawn. When she finally woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and she could hear Grandmother Willow moving around in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Over the next few days, Rosa began to understand that she had found something precious and rare, a place where being different wasn't seen as being wrong. The Apache community had its own experience with being outcasts, with being pushed to the margins of society and told they didn't belong. They understood what it meant to survive when the world seemed set against you. Joe Crow Dog came by every afternoon to check on Rosa and tell her stories about Apache history and culture. His wife Anna visited too, bringing her teenage daughter Lucy and teaching Rosa traditional beadwork that could be done entirely by touch. Rosa's sensitive fingers proved perfect for the intricate patterns, and soon she was creating designs that amazed even the experienced beadworkers. Your hands see better than most people's eyes, Anna told her one afternoon as Rosa completed a particularly complex bracelet. This is a gift, not a curse. These were the first words Rosa had ever heard that suggested her blindness might be something other than a burden to be endured. She held the finished bracelet, feeling the smooth beads and perfect pattern, and realized that Anna was right. Her hands could indeed see in a way that went deeper than sight. The reservation school welcomed Rosa without question or paperwork. The teacher, a young Apache woman named Mary Little Bear, had experience working with children who had been through trauma. She never pushed Rosa to talk about her past, instead focusing on helping her learn to read Braille and develop the academic skills she would need for the future. Education is armor, Mary Little Bear told Rosa during one of their tutoring sessions. The more you learn, the harder it becomes for anyone to take advantage of you or convince you that you're not worth protecting. Rosa threw herself into learning with a fierce determination that impressed everyone around her. She mastered Braille quickly, devouring books about everything from history to science to literature. She learned Apache phrases and customs, absorbing the culture of the people who had welcomed her with such open hearts. But it was Grandmother Willow who helped Rosa begin to heal the deepest wounds. The old woman seemed to understand that Rosa needed to process not just what had happened to her, but what it meant about her worth as a human being. Your parents made a choice out of fear and poverty, Grandmother Willow said one evening as they sat on the porch listening to the night sounds. That choice was about their limitations, not about your value. You understand the difference? Rosa nodded, though it was hard to fully believe. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had been born able to see, if they would have loved me enough to keep me. Child, Grandmother Willow said, reaching over to take Rosa's hand. Love that depends on conditions isn't love at all. It's just convenience wearing love's costume. Real love sees the whole person, not just the parts that are easy to accept. As spring turned to summer, Rosa began to feel like she truly belonged on the reservation. People knew her name, included her in conversations, asked her opinions about things. Children who had been shy around her at first now sought her out, fascinated by her ability to navigate the world without sight, and eager to learn her tricks for memorizing locations and recognizing voices. Rosa also discovered that her experience, surviving in hostile environments, had given her skills that others found valuable. When new children arrived at the school, refugees from various difficult situations, Rosa became their unofficial guide, helping them understand how to be alert without being afraid, how to read people's intentions through their voices and behavior. You have wisdom that can only come from surviving hard things, Merry Little Bear observed. That's not a burden. It's a superpower, if you choose to use it that way. One afternoon in late summer, Rosa was sitting under her favorite tree near the school, working on a particularly challenging piece of beadwork, when she heard unfamiliar voices approaching, adult voices speaking English with authority and purpose, official voices that made Rosa's stomach clench with sudden fear. "We're looking for a girl who might have come through here," one of the voices was saying to someone Rosa couldn't see. Mexican, about 11 or 12 years old, blind. She ran away from her legal guardians, and they're very concerned about her welfare. Rosa's hands froze on her beadwork. Somehow, the Johnson family had tracked her. The tribal council meeting room had never held so much tension. Rosa could feel it pressing against her skin like humidity before a storm, heavy and electric with the weight of decisions that would change lives forever. She sat in a chair that seemed too big for her 12-year-old frame, her hands folded in her lap, surrounded by more adults than she had ever been in a room with at one time. It had been 3 days since the social workers arrived, 3 days of hushed conversations, and phone calls and official-looking people arriving at the reservation in government cars. Rosa had spent those days with Grandmother Willow, who had held her close and whispered Apache prayers for strength and wisdom. Now, sitting in this room full of strangers and half-strangers, Rosa could identify the different groups by sound and smell and the particular way each person breathed when they were nervous or angry, or trying to hide their true feelings. To her left sat the tribal council, 5 Apache men and women whose voices she had learned to recognize over the past months. Their breathing was steady, controlled, but she could hear the tension in the slight tightness of their words when they spoke. They were prepared to fight for her, she realized, even though she wasn't technically their responsibility. Across the room sat the social workers, 2 women whose voices carried the crisp authority of people who made life-changing decisions about children every day. One of them, Ms. Rodriguez, had been kind when she interviewed Rosa. The other, Mrs. Patterson, seemed more interested in paperwork than people. Near the back of the room sat the Johnson family. Rosa could smell Mrs. Johnson's perfume, the same sickly sweet scent that had filled the house where Rosa had spent 3 miserable years. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat frequently, a nervous habit Rosa remembered from the nights when he had too much to drink. They sat quietly, but Rosa could feel their anger radiating across the room like heat from a stove. And then there were her birth parents. Carmen and Diego had arrived that morning, brought by the Mexican consulate after the social workers had tracked down Rosa's original family. Rosa had heard her mother crying in the hallway before the meeting began, but now Carmen sat silent as stone, her breathing shallow and quick, with what Rosa suspected was shame rather than grief. Her father's presence was harder to read. He had always been a quiet man, and the years hadn't changed that. But Rosa could sense something different about him now, a heaviness that hadn't been there when she was small. Maybe guilt, maybe regret, maybe just the weight of poverty that had driven him to make an unthinkable choice. The tribal council chairman, Robert Ironcloud, called the meeting to order. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of advocating for people who had no one else to speak for them. "We're here today to determine the best placement for Rosa Sandoval," he began. "We have several parties who have expressed interest in her welfare, and we need to hear from all of them before any decisions are made." Mrs. Patterson spoke first, reading from a file in a voice that turned Rosa into a series of facts and dates, and legal complications. Subject is a 12-year-old female, Mexican national, blind from birth, originally placed with the Johnson family through informal channels. No documentation of legal adoption or guardianship. Current placement with tribal members is temporary and has no legal standing. "Informal channels," muttered Joe Crow Dog from somewhere behind Rosa. "Is that what we're calling human trafficking now?" Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat and continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "The Johnson family maintains that Rosa ran away from a safe, stable home environment, and that they are prepared to resume their guardianship responsibilities. Mrs. Johnson spoke up then, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. We took that girl in when no one else wanted her, fed her, clothed her, gave her a home. She was ungrateful and ran away, putting herself in terrible danger. We're willing to take her back, but there need to be assurances that this kind of behavior won't happen again. Rosa felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. 3 years of swallowed words. 3 years of accepting abuse because she had nowhere else to go. 3 years of being told she should be grateful for treatment that no human being should have to endure. "May I speak?" Rosa asked quietly. The room fell silent. Mrs. Patterson rustled her papers. "This is highly irregular. The child isn't technically a party to these proceedings." "The child has a name," Robert Ironcloud said firmly. "And this is her life we're discussing. Rosa, would you like to tell us your story?" Rosa stood up slowly, her legs shaky but her voice steady. She had practiced this moment in her mind for days, but now that it was here, she found herself calmer than she had expected. The truth had a weight of its own, and all she had to do was let it speak through her. "My name is Rosa Sandoval," she began. "I was born in San Miguel, Mexico in 1952. When I was 8 years old, my parents sold me to strangers because they said my blindness made me a burden they couldn't carry." She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, but continued without pause. "The people who bought me brought me across the border and gave me to the Johnson family. They told me I should be grateful because I had food and shelter, but I was never treated like a member of their family. I was treated like property." Mrs. Johnson started to protest, but Robert Ironcloud held up a hand for silence. Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I slept in the basement. I worked from early morning until late at night, cleaning and cooking and doing laundry. When I made mistakes, I was punished with harsh words and sometimes worse. I was told repeatedly that I was worthless, that I should be thankful anyone would want me at all." The room was completely silent now. Rosa could feel the attention of every person present focused on her like sunlight through a magnifying glass. 3 months ago, I overheard Mr. and Mrs. Johnson planning to sell me to another family. They said I was eating too much and getting too big, and that people were starting to ask questions. They had found someone who would pay them more money than they had paid for me originally. "That's not true," Mrs. Johnson burst out. "We were trying to find her a better placement, somewhere more suitable for her special needs." Rosa turned toward Mrs. Johnson's voice, her blind eyes somehow seeming to look directly at the woman who had made her life miserable for 3 years. "If that's true," Rosa said calmly, "then why didn't you ask me what I wanted? Why didn't you explain that you were trying to help me instead of talking about selling me like I was a piece of furniture you were tired of looking at?" Mrs. Johnson had no answer for that. Rosa turned back to the room at large. "That night I decided I would rather die free in the desert than spend the rest of my life being passed from one family to another, like something to be bought and sold. So I ran away." She told them about her journey through the desert, about nearly dying of thirst and exposure, about being found by Joe Crow Dog and his brothers. She told them about the kindness of Grandmother Willow, about learning beadwork from Anna, about discovering that her blindness could be a source of strength rather than shame. "For the first time in my life," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion, but still steady, "I have been treated like a human being who has value just because I exist. I have been loved without conditions, accepted without judgment. I have learned that being blind doesn't make me broken or worthless or a burden." She paused, gathering herself for the hardest part of what she had to say. "I understand that my birth parents made their choice out of desperation and poverty. I don't hate them for it. But they gave up their right to call themselves my parents when they decided that their financial problems were more important than their child's safety and well-being." Carmen began to cry quietly, but Rosa wasn't finished. "And the Johnson family never saw me as anything more than free labor. They took a child who had already been abandoned once and convinced her that abuse was the same thing as care, that she should be grateful for cruelty, as long as it came with food and shelter." Rosa's voice hardened, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, she sounded angry. "But I'm not grateful. I'm not grateful for being treated like property. I'm not grateful for being made to believe that my blindness made me less than human. I'm not grateful for being told that I should accept whatever scraps of kindness people were willing to throw my way. She turned toward where she knew her birth parents were sitting. You sold me because I was blind. You looked at your daughter and decided that her disability was more important than her humanity. You chose your own comfort over your child's safety, and then you told yourselves it was for my own good. The silence in the room was so complete that Rosa could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. She could feel the shock and discomfort of the adults around her, none of whom had expected a 12-year-old blind girl to speak with such clarity and force about her own life. But Rosa wasn't finished yet. She had one more thing to say, the most important thing of all. I know what it feels like to be unwanted, she said, her voice soft again but carrying clearly to every corner of the room. And I know what it feels like to be truly welcomed. The Apache people didn't take me in because they had to, or because someone paid them to, or because they felt sorry for me. They took me in because they saw me as I really am, a person worth protecting, worth teaching. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Rosa remained standing, her hands steady at her sides, waiting for someone to respond to the truth she had just laid bare before them all. She could feel the emotional turbulence in the room, shock, shame, anger, and something else that took her a moment to identify. Respect. Finally, Robert Ironcloud spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of what they had all just heard. Thank you, Rosa, he said simply. Your courage in speaking your truth honors us all. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat, the sound sharp and uncomfortable in the thick silence. While the child's testimony is compelling, we still have legal procedures that must be followed. The Johnson family maintains their position as her previous guardians, and her biological parents have rights under Mexican law that... Rights? The voice that interrupted belonged to Joe Crow Dog, and it carried a controlled fury that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. What rights do people have when they sell their children like livestock? What rights do people have when they buy children and treat them as slaves? Carmen spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice broken with tears. We had no choice, she whispered in heavily accented English. We had no food, no money. The drought killed everything. We thought she would have a better life. Rosa turned toward her mother's voice, and when she spoke, her words were not angry but infinitely sad. You had a choice, Mama. You could have chosen to keep your family together, even if it meant being poor together. You could have chosen to see me as your daughter instead of as a burden, but you didn't choose me. You chose the money they offered instead. Diego finally spoke, his voice rough with years of guilt. We were wrong, he said in Spanish, then repeated it in broken English. We were wrong, but we cannot change what is done. No, Rosa agreed. You can't change what's done, but you can. Stop pretending it was anything other than what it was. You sold your daughter because she was blind, and you've had 4 years to live with that choice. She turned back toward the tribal council. I don't want to punish my birth parents. They've punished themselves enough, and I don't want revenge against the Johnson family, even though they deserve whatever consequences the law gives them. I just want to live with people who see me as family, not as property or as charity. Mrs. Patterson shuffled her papers again. The Apache tribe has no legal standing to adopt a Mexican national. Even if we were to remove the child from the Johnson home, she would need to be placed with a certified foster family or returned to Mexico with her birth parents. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the room, that's not entirely accurate. Everyone turned to see a man in a suit Rosa didn't recognize. He had been sitting quietly throughout the entire meeting, taking notes and observing. Who are you? Mrs. Patterson demanded. David White Eagle, attorney specializing in Native American law and children's rights. The tribal council asked me to review this case. He opened a briefcase and pulled out several folders. I've been researching the legal options, and I believe there are several avenues we can pursue. Rosa felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but she tried not to let it show. She had learned not to trust in rescue coming from adults with official papers and legal words. Mr. White Eagle continued. First, there's the matter of the original placement. Rosa was trafficked across international borders and placed with the Johnson family without any legal adoption procedures. This makes the Johnsons' claim to guardianship invalid. Second, Rosa has been living on the reservation for several months and has been formally welcomed into the community. Under the Indian Child Welfare Act, tribes have significant authority over children in their care, regardless of the child's original citizenship. But she's not Native American, Mrs. Patterson protested. No, but she has been formally adopted into the tribal community through traditional ceremony. Grandmother Willow performed the adoption ritual 6 weeks ago, witnessed by the entire tribal council. That gives Rosa legal standing as a member of the Apache tribe. Rosa gasped. She had known about the ceremony. It had been one of the most beautiful experiences of her life, sitting in a circle with the tribal elders as Grandmother Willow spoke, the ancient words that made Rosa her granddaughter in the eyes of the Apache people, but she hadn't realized it had legal implications. Furthermore, Mr. White Eagle continued, I've been in contact with the FBI's human trafficking unit. They're very interested in investigating how an 8-year-old blind child was brought across the border and placed with a family who used her for unpaid labor. The Johnson family might want to consider cooperating with authorities rather than fighting for custody of a child they clearly don't want anyway. Mr. Johnson spoke for the first time, his voice tight with fear. We never did anything illegal. We just gave her a home when nobody else would. A home, Rosa repeated, her voice steady but cutting. Is that what you call making a child sleep in a basement and work 16 hours a day? Is that what you call threatening to sell her to the highest bidder? Mrs. Johnson tried one more time. She's exaggerating. Children always exaggerate when they're upset. But Rosa was ready for this. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing they would try to discredit her testimony. Mrs. Johnson, she said calmly, you have a scar on your left hand from when you burned it on the stove making Christmas cookies in 1954. You keep your jewelry in a blue box on your bedroom dresser, and you have $17 hidden in a coffee can in the pantry. You think I know these things because I was sneaking around your house spying on you? Mrs. Johnson's face went white. I know these things because I lived in that house for 3 years, cleaning every room, handling every dish, listening to every conversation. I know that you and your husband fought about money every Tuesday after he got paid. I know that you cried on Thursday nights when you thought everyone was asleep. I know that your son stole money from your purse to buy comic books. I know all of this because I was there, invisible and unwanted, but still listening, still remembering, still human even when you treated me like I wasn't. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like the moment when a jury reaches a verdict, when all the arguments have been made and the truth is finally clear to everyone. Robert Ironcloud spoke first. The tribal council has heard enough. We formally request that Rosa Sandoval be allowed to remain with her adopted Apache family. We will provide all necessary documentation and support for her legal status. Ms. Rodriguez, the kinder of the 2 social workers, nodded slowly. Given the circumstances of the original placement and the clear evidence of the child's well-being in her current situation, I'm inclined to support the tribal council's request. Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to argue, but Mr. White Eagle was already pulling out more papers. I have preliminary approval from Immigration Services for Rosa to apply for special juvenile status, which would allow her to remain in the United States permanently. I also have documentation from the reservation school showing her academic progress and statements from community members about her integration into tribal life. Carmen stood up suddenly, tears streaming down her face. Mi hija, she said, reaching toward Rosa. Please, can you forgive us? Rosa didn't move toward her birth mother, but her voice was gentle when she answered. I forgive you, Mama. But forgiveness doesn't mean I can forget what happened, or pretend it didn't change me. You made your choice 4 years ago. Now I'm making mine. Diego stood up too, his hat clutched in his hands. What do you choose, mija? Rosa turned toward where she knew Grandmother Willow was sitting. The old woman had been quiet throughout the entire meeting, but Rosa could feel her steady, loving presence like an anchor in the storm of all these difficult emotions. I choose family, Rosa said clearly. Real family, The family that chose me not because they had to, not because someone paid them to, but because they saw something in me worth loving. I choose the grandmother who taught me that being blind doesn't make me broken. I choose the people who showed me that I have value just because I'm alive. She straightened her shoulders and looked around the room with her blind eyes that somehow seemed to see everything that mattered. I choose the Apache people who welcomed me when I was lost and made me part of their community when I had nowhere else to belong. They didn't save me because I was a charity case. They saved me because that's what families do. They protect each other. Grandmother Willow spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between law and justice. "This child is my granddaughter," she said simply. "She has been my granddaughter since the day she walked into my house more dead than alive, and I saw the strength in her spirit. The papers you want to fill out and the procedures you want to follow, they don't make family. Love makes family. Choice makes family. And this girl chose us just as surely as we chose her." Mr. White Eagle smiled for the first time since he'd entered the room. "I think we can make the legal documents match the reality that already exists. Rosa, are you prepared to officially become Rosa Sandoval Crowfeather, enrolled member of the Apache tribe?"